When Boeing's new bomber lifted off the ground in 1935, few could have guessed it would become one of the most famous aircraft of the 20th century. The press quickly dubbed it the Flying Fortress, and the name stuck. At a glance, it was bigger and more powerful than anything America had ever built before. 4 engines, a long, graceful wing, and the promise of carrying war farther than anyone thought possible. But what made the B-17 truly historic was not just its size or its looks. It embodied a bold idea, one that shaped America's air strategy in World War II. Army Air Corps planners believed that fleets of heavy bombers, flying by daylight in tight formation, could cripple an enemy's ability to wage war, hit the factories, the refineries, the rail yards, and you might never need to land an invasion force at all. It was a radical departure from the British approach, which relied on night raids over Germany. Americans wanted precision in broad daylight. That meant meeting flak and fighters head-on. And for that task, they placed their faith in the B-17, a machine that would come to symbolize not just American air power, but the hope that the war could be won from the sky. If the B-17 began as an idea, it was the way Boeing built it that turned that idea into steel and aluminum reality. The airframe stretched more than 74 feet from nose to tail, with a wingspan of nearly 104 feet, just a little shorter than a modern 737. On the ground, it stood over 19 feet tall, a towering presence even before its engines roared to life. Its skin was made of duralumin, a lightweight alloy that looked delicate but was stronger than it seemed. In fact, it was no thicker than a few sheets of household foil pressed together. Yet beneath that thin surface lay a framework of ribs, spars, and trusses that gave the fortress its legendary toughness. Pilots would later swear that this combination of light skin and rugged bones was why so many crippled bombers managed to limp back across the channel. The interior was built in sections, each one with a specific purpose. The glassed-in nose for navigation and bombing, the cockpit just behind, then the bomb bay, the radio room, the waist positions, and finally, the tail. Every part was carefully thought out, not for comfort, but for war. It was a flying machine designed to take men into the heart of enemy territory, and with luck, bring them home again. No war machine ever stays the same for long, and the B-17 was no exception. The early models that rolled out in the late 1930s looked almost fragile compared to what came later. Each new version carried lessons written in smoke and fire over Europe. By the time the B-17F appeared, the bomber had grown heavier, tougher, and better armed. The F model could carry a larger bomb load and bristled with more .50 caliber machine guns than its predecessors. Still, crews complained about awkward details, like waist gun positions set directly across from each other, so cramped that gunners sometimes bumped shoulders while fighting off attacks. Then came the B-17G, the final and most numerous variant, with more than 8,600 built. It answered one of the fortress's most dangerous weaknesses, the nose. German fighters had learned to come head-on, where firepower was thin. The G solved that with a chin turret carrying twin .5s, giving the crew a fighting chance against those deadly frontal assaults. In all, over 12,700 B-17 of every type rolled off American assembly lines between 1935 and 1945. Each carried small refinements, each shaped by combat experience. Taken together, they turned the Flying Fortress from an ambitious prototype into one of the most enduring symbols of American air power. For all its size and power, the B-17 was nothing without its crew. 10 men climbed aboard for every mission, each with a role as vital as the next. They worked in spaces so tight and noisy that teamwork wasn't just important, it was survival. Up front, in the glass nose, sat the bombardier and navigator. The navigator charted the long miles over open water and enemy territory, pencil on map, eyes on the stars. Beside him, the bombardier prepared for the moment of truth, when the fortress would fly straight and level, and the Norden bomb sight guided its deadly cargo onto target. Just behind, on the flight deck, were the pilot and co-pilot, guiding more than 30 tons of airplane through flak and fighters. Above them, the flight engineer manned the top turret, scanning the skies while keeping a constant eye on fuel, engines, and systems. In the waist, 2 gunners stood at open windows, their .5s barking against attacks from the sides. Beneath the fuselage, the ball turret gunner curled inside a small spinning sphere, suspended between earth and sky. Behind them all, in the tail, one man alone guarded the fortress's vulnerable rear. Each station was a world unto itself. Together, they made the B-17 a living, breathing war machine. 10 men, 1 airplane, bound by trust and the hope of getting home. The B-17 earned its nickname not only because of its size, but because of the firepower bristling from every angle. By the time the final models went to war, a fortress carried up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns. A fighter closing in from almost any direction would find itself flying into a storm of tracers. But one bomber alone was never truly safe. The real strength of the B-17 lay in formation. Dozens of fortresses would climb into the sky, wheeling into box shapes so tight that the fields of fire overlapped. A fighter attacking from behind might face not just a tail gunner, but a dozen waist and turret guns all pouring fire into its path. To the German pilots, it could look like a wall of bullets stretching across the sky. Inside, the crew called out threats over the intercom using the clock system. "Bandits, 3 o'clock low!" meant enemy aircraft off the right wing coming in below. Gunners would swing to meet the threat, their weapons chattering in reply. It was organized chaos, a deadly dance of discipline and instinct. Flying in these tight groups multiplied the fortress's defense, but it also demanded trust. One slip, one wrong move, and a mid-air collision could be as deadly as enemy fire. It was the price of survival in the daylight skies over Europe. For all its guns and armor, the B-17 had one purpose above all: to deliver bombs on target. Inside its narrow bomb bay, the fortress could carry up to 8 1,000-pound bombs. In a pinch, external racks under the wings could add more weight, but most missions settled on a lighter load, 4 to 6,000 pounds, so the bomber could reach deeper into enemy territory. Every pound mattered. Fuel, altitude, weather, and distance were weighed against the bomb load before a mission ever began. Crews knew that carrying the maximum meant shorter range and less chance of making it home. Still, when orders came down, the fortress was expected to shoulder the burden. The moment of truth came on the bomb run. As the formation neared the target, the pilot handed control of the airplane to the bombardier. Using the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical wonder of gyros and gears, the bombardier lined up the crosshairs, corrected for speed and wind, and waited. While flak burst around them, the crew had to hold steady, flying straight and level. No weaving, no dodging, no escape. Then came the words everyone strained to hear. "Bombs away." The bay doors clanged shut, control returned to the pilot, and the fortress turned for home, leaving fire and smoke behind. What gave the flying fortress its heartbeat were 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each a 9-cylinder powerhouse, turning a 3-bladed propeller. At cruising speed, they pushed the B-17 along at about 200 miles an hour. In a pinch, with throttles wide open, the bomber could top out near 300 miles an hour at 25,000 feet. Crews knew that wasn't enough to outrun a fighter, but it was steady and reliable, built for the long haul. Fuel was stored in tanks spread through the wings, 6 main tanks holding around 1,700 gallons, with additional Tokyo tanks tucked into the structure to extend range. On missions where distance mattered more than payload, auxiliary tanks could be added, raising capacity to more than 3,500 gallons. It was a delicate balance. More fuel meant less bomb weight, but sometimes range meant survival. The systems inside were surprisingly simple. Hydraulics handled only the basics: wheel brakes and cowl flaps. Everything else, from turrets to bomb bay doors, ran on electricity. That meant as long as even one engine was alive, the fortress could still fight, still drop bombs, still bring its crew home. Again and again, pilots discovered that a B-17 could lose an engine, sometimes two, and still limp back across the channel. It was this toughness, as much as its firepower, that made the fortress a legend. The true test of the flying fortress came not in training fields, but in the bitter skies over Europe. August 17, 1943, was one of those days. Hundreds of B-17s roared off English runways, bound for factories at Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The targets were vital: aircraft production in one city, ball bearings in the other. The gamble was that crippling them might cripple Germany itself. What the crews met instead was a storm of fighters and flak. Luftwaffe squadrons struck again and again, tearing into the formations. By day's end, 60 bombers had gone down, with hundreds of airmen killed, captured, or missing. Survivors would never forget the sight of fortresses burning in mid-air or tumbling toward the ground with no parachutes in sight. Just weeks later came October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday. On that mission to Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost another 60 bombers out of 291 sent. 1 in 5 planes never returned. The men who did were shaken to the core, their belief in daylight precision shaken but not broken. It wasn't until the arrival of long-range escorts, first P-38s and P-47s, and then the sleek P-51 Mustang, that the tide began to turn. By early 1944, the B-17s could finally reach Berlin and beyond with fighters alongside. Losses remained heavy, but the scales were shifting. The gamble of daylight bombing was starting to pay off. Behind every mission report were young men barely out of high school, carrying the weight of war on their shoulders. The odds they faced were staggering. In the early years of daylight bombing, only about half of all crewmen completed a full tour. The rest were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. For those who climbed into a fortress at dawn, the question was never if they'd be hit. It was how bad, and whether they'd make it home. The strain was more than physical. Crews lived with the constant thunder of flak, the sight of wingmen exploding in mid-air, the dread of watching parachutes that never opened. Some men turned to good luck charms or routines, others simply grew numb. Psychologists later called it flak-happy, the breaking point where nerves could no longer stand the pressure. Yet even in the darkest skies, the B-17 earned its reputation for toughness. Stories spread of bombers limping home with gaping holes in their fuselage, missing engines, even missing tails. One aircraft, nicknamed All-American, lost nearly its entire rear section after a collision, yet still made it back to base. Alan Magee, a bald turret gunner, was blown out of his fortress without a parachute. He fell 4 miles, crashed through a glass roof, and lived. Others crawled from wreckage no one believed survivable. These stories became legends, reminders that while the flying fortress was made of aluminum and steel, what truly kept it in the air was the courage of the men inside. By the war's end, more than 12,000 flying fortresses had been built. Most never saw a second life. They were scrapped in quiet fields across England, their aluminum melted down to help rebuild a shattered Europe. Yet a handful survived, and those few have become priceless treasures. When a B-17 flies at an air show today, its engines rumbling over the crowd, it carries with it the memory of thousands who never came home. The Memphis Belle, famous for completing 25 missions, remains the best known of them all. Restored and displayed, it reminds us that the fortress was more than a machine. It was a symbol of sacrifice, determination, and the belief that freedom was worth the cost. The lesson of the B-17 is clear. Technology can shape strategy, but it is the courage of ordinary men that gives it meaning. The gamble of daylight bombing came at a terrible price, yet it helped pave the way for victory in Europe And now, the memory belongs to us. If you've ever seen a flying fortress in the air, or maybe even served on one, share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your memories. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so these voices from the sky will never be forgotten.